The violet petals had begun to curl at the edges, just like everything else in Maeve's life that spring. She stood at her kitchen window, watching the African violet on the sill, the same plant Harold had given her 43 years ago on their first anniversary. Its leaves drooped slightly, starved for the morning light that the new construction next door had stolen away. "Mom, we need to talk." Dawn's voice cut through the quiet like a blade through silk. At 69, Maeve had learned to recognize that particular tone, the one that meant her daughter had already made up her mind about something, and the conversation was just a formality. Maeve didn't turn around. She kept her hands wrapped around the chipped ceramic mug Harold had made in that pottery class he'd taken during his retirement. The coffee had gone cold 20 minutes ago, but she held on to it anyway, the way she'd been holding on to so many things lately that no longer served their purpose. About what, sweetheart? The endearment felt foreign on her tongue now. When had that happened? When had the natural rhythm of motherly affection begun to sound forced, even to her own ears? Dave's footsteps echoed to the house, heavy, deliberate, claiming space. He'd been doing that more and more lately, walking through her home like he owned it. Behind him, Dawn's lighter steps followed in that careful, measured way she developed over the past 2 years, like someone walking on ice, never quite sure when it might crack beneath her feet. "The house is too much for you now," Dawn said, settling into a chair across from Maeve at the small kitchen table. The same table where Maeve had helped Dawn with homework, where they planned her wedding, where Harold had read the morning paper every day for 37 years, until morning when he simply couldn't anymore. Dave remained standing, his bulk filling the doorway between the kitchen and the living room. He wore that smile Maeve had never trusted, the one that didn't reach his eyes, the one that made promises he had no intention of keeping. "Your daughter's worried about you, Maeve," he said, using her first name in that casual way that always made her skin crawl. Her own daughter called her mom, but this man who'd known her for less than 5 years felt entitled to use a name only Harold and her dearest friends had ever used. Maeve finally turned from the window. The morning light caught the silver in her hair that Dawn had been suggesting she color for months now, as if gray were something shameful, something to hide. But Harold had loved watching it turn silver. "Like moonlight on water," he used to say, running his fingers through it as they sat on the porch swing he'd built with his own hands. "I'm managing just fine," Maeve said quietly, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt building in her chest. Dawn's face crumpled slightly, and for a moment, Maeve glimpsed the little girl who used to crawl into bed with her parents during thunderstorms. But the moment passed, and Dawn's expression hardened into something that looked disturbingly like her husband's practiced concern. "Mom, you left the stove on last week. Mrs. Patterson called me because she smelled gas." The lie landed between them like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of hurt in all directions. Maeve had never left the stove on. She remembered everything about that day, how she'd made Harold's favorite beef stew, how the smell had filled the house with memories, how carefully she'd turned off each burner and checked them twice, the way Harold had taught her to do 40 years ago. But here was her daughter, the child she'd carried beneath her heart, the baby she'd rocked through countless sleepless nights, looking her in the eye and telling her a lie so casual and cruel that it took Maeve's breath away. "That's not true," Maeve said, but her voice sounded smaller now, less certain. Dave stepped further into the kitchen, his presence swallowing up the space like a shadow falling across sunshine. "Maeve, denial is the first sign. My grandmother went through the same thing. The kindest thing we ever did was get her proper care." Proper care. The words hung in the air like a threat dressed up as kindness. Maeve had heard those words before, whispered in grocery store aisles by families who thought they were doing the right thing, who convinced themselves that warehousing their elderly was love disguised as practicality. "I don't need care," Maeve said, her hands tightening around a coffee mug until her knuckles went white. "I need my home." Dawn reached across the table and covered Maeve's hand with her own. Her skin was soft, unmarked by the years of cooking and cleaning, and building a life that had left their map on Maeve's hands. "Mom, Sunshine Manor is beautiful. They have activities and other people your age, and other people whose families gave up on them." The words came out sharper than Maeve had intended, and she watched her daughter flinch as if she'd been slapped. But sometimes the truth was a slap, wasn't it? Sometimes it was the only thing that could wake people up from the comfortable lies they told themselves. Dave's voice turned cold, all pretense of kindness evaporating like morning mist. Well, maybe if you were more reasonable about this, we wouldn't have to have these difficult conversations. There it was. The real Dave, the one who'd been hiding behind that false smile and practiced concern. The one who'd been circling Maeve's life like a vulture, waiting for the right moment to swoop down and claim what he thought was his. Dawn's hand tightened over Maeve's, but it didn't feel like comfort anymore. It felt like a trap closing around her wrist, gentle but inescapable. "We've already put a deposit down," Dawn said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The room will be available next month." The coffee mug slipped from Maeve's other hand and shattered against the kitchen floor, sending ceramic shards skittering across the linoleum like scattered pieces of a broken heart. The sound echoed to the house, through all the rooms where she'd loved and lost and learned to live again, through all the spaces that held the echoes of Harold's laughter and Dawn's childhood and 43 years of a life well lived. As she bent to gather the pieces, her fingers trembling as they collected fragments of Harold's handiwork, Maeve felt something shift inside her chest. It was a small thing at first, no bigger than a seed, but it carried within the potential for something her daughter and son-in-law couldn't possibly imagine. It carried within it the quiet, patient strength of a woman who had survived 69 years of love and loss, who had buried a husband and raised a daughter, and learned that the most dangerous people were often the ones who claimed to have your best interests at heart. The violet on the windowsill caught her eye as she straightened up, clutching the ceramic pieces in her palm. Despite the reduced light, despite the neglect, it was still trying to bloom, still reaching toward whatever light it could find, just like Maeve herself was about to do. The basement smelled like Harold's aftershave and 40 years of Christmas decorations stored in careful rows. Maeve descended the wooden steps slowly, her hand trailing along the banister he'd sanded and stained himself back when his hands were steady and his future stretched out before him like an unwritten book. She hadn't been down here since the funeral. Hadn't been able to face the workshop where he'd spent his retirement years building birdhouses for neighborhood children and refinishing furniture that people threw away too quickly. But now, 3 days after Dawn and Dave's ultimatum, she found herself drawn to this space where Harold had always gone to think. The pegboard still held his tools in perfect order. Hammers and screwdrivers and measuring tapes arranged with the precision of a man who understood that everything had its place. His workbench bore the stains of countless projects, and dust motes danced in the single beam of afternoon light that slanted to the high basement window. But it was a filing cabinet in the corner that drew Maeve's attention. Harold had always been meticulous about paperwork, almost obsessively so. "You never know when you might need something," he used to say, filing away insurance documents and tax returns and warranties for appliances they'd long since replaced. The top drawer slid open with a whisper, revealing folders labeled in Harold's careful handwriting. Insurance, taxes 2019, taxes 2020, medical bills. But there, in the very back, was a folder she'd never noticed before. Her name was written across the tab in letters that seemed more urgent somehow, darker, as if he'd pressed the pen harder against the paper. Inside, she found documents she'd never seen. Legal papers with official seals and signatures, property deeds that made her heart skip in her chest, and a letter in Harold's familiar script that began with words that changed everything. "My dearest Maeve, if you're reading this, then the vultures have begun to circle." Her hand shook as she read on. Each were a revelation that painted her marriage in colors she'd never recognized. Harold hadn't just been her husband. He'd been her protector, even from beyond the grave. Every document in the folder told the same story. He'd seen this day coming, had prepared for it with a methodical precision he brought to everything he cared about. The house wasn't just in her name. It had been structured in a way that made it impossible for anyone else to claim. The small apartment building downtown that she thought Dave owned through some complicated business arrangement, Harold had been the silent partner, the one whose investment had made it possible. And Dave's construction company, the one he bragged about at family dinners while looking at Maeve like she was too simple to understand business, Harold had been funding it for years, carefully, quietly, with agreements that Dave had apparently never bothered to read carefully. Maeve sank into Harold's old wooden chair, the one he'd salvaged from a demolition site and lovingly restored. The implications of what she was reading began to settle over her, like dust in an abandoned room. Dave hadn't married Dawn for love. He'd married her for access. Access to a family he thought was made up of a naive old woman and her easily manipulated daughter. But Harold had been watching. Harold had been planning. The last document in the folder was a business card for someone named Victoria Reeves, attorney at law, with a note in Harold's handwriting. She helped me set everything up. She'll help you when the time comes. And Maeve, don't let them make you feel small. You were never small. Maeve pressed the letter to her chest and closed her eyes, and for a moment she could almost feel Harold's presence in the room with her, could almost hear his voice saying the words he'd written, could almost smell his aftershave mixing with the scent of sawdust and old wood. When she opened her eyes, the basement looked different somehow, not like a storage space for forgotten things, but like a command center, a place where battles were planned and strategies were born. She climbed the stairs with more purpose than she'd felt in months. The folder clutched against her chest like armor. In the kitchen, the African violet seemed to sit up a little straighter on the windowsill, as if it too had felt a shift in the atmosphere. Maeve reached her phone, her finger steady now as she dialed the number on Victoria Reeves's business card. A receptionist answered with professional courtesy, and Maeve found herself asking for an appointment with a voice she barely recognized as her own, stronger somehow, more certain. "May I ask what this is regarding?" the receptionist inquired. Maeve looked around her kitchen, at the table where Dawn had lied to her face, at the floor where Harold's mug had shattered, at the windowsill where the violet was trying so hard to bloom despite everything working against it. "It's regarding a woman who's tired of being underestimated," she said. The appointment was scheduled for the following morning. Maeve hung up the phone and stood for a long moment in the quiet house, feeling something she hadn't experienced in years. It took her several minutes to recognize what it was, this unfamiliar sensation spreading through her chest like warmth from a long, cold fireplace. It was power, not the kind that came from money or influence or the ability to intimidate others. It was a power that came from knowledge, from preparation, from the love of a man who had seen danger coming and had quietly, methodically built a fortress around the woman he cherished. That evening, when Dawn called to check on her and subtly remind her about the moving timeline for Sunshine Manor, Maeve found herself responding with a calmness that seemed to unsettle her daughter. "I've been thinking about what you said," Maeve told her, "about the house being too much for me." "Oh, Mom, I'm so glad you're being reasonable about this." Dawn's relief was palpable through the phone line. "Dave and I were worried you'd try to fight us on it." "Fighting is such an ugly word," Maeve said, running her finger along the edge of Harold's folder. "I prefer to think of it as clarifying the situation." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "What do you mean?" "I mean that tomorrow I'm going to have a conversation with someone who can help me understand exactly what my options are. And then, sweetheart, I think you and Dave and I need to have a very different kind of talk." After she hung up, Maeve made herself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table with Harold's letter spread out before her. She read it 3 more times, memorizing every word, letting his love and his foresight settle into her bones like medicine. Outside, the sun was setting behind the new construction that had stolen her Violet's morning light. But somehow, she had the feeling that tomorrow would dawn brighter than it had in a very long time. The house around her seemed to sigh and settle, as if it too were preparing for whatever came next. In 43 years of marriage, Harold had never let her down. She had no reason to believe he would start now. Victoria Reeves had silver hair like Maeve's, but she wore like a crown, swept back from a face that spoke of courtrooms conquered and battles won. Her office smelled of leather and confidence, and when she looked at the document Harold had left behind, her eyes lit up with something that looked distinctly like anticipation. "Your husband was a very clever man," Victoria said, settling back in her chair with Harold's carefully prepared file spread across a mahogany desk. "And he loved you very much." Maeve twisted her wedding ring around her finger, a habit she developed in the months since Harold's death whenever she felt overwhelmed. "I had no idea he was arranging things this way. He came to see me about 3 years ago," Victoria explained. "Said his son-in-law was asking too many questions about your assets, making comment about how the house was too much for you." Harold was worried. 3 years ago, Maeve tried to remember what Dave had been like then, whether there had been signs she'd missed. But looking back now, she realized the signs had been everywhere. The casual questions about home values, the suggestions about downsizing, the way he'd started treating her house like a family asset rather than her personal sanctuary. What exactly did Harold set up? Maeve asked. Victoria smiled, and it was the kind of smile that had probably struck fear into the hearts of opposing counsel for decades. A beautifully crafted web of legal protections. The house is yours, completely and irrevocably. But more than that, your husband owns 60% of your son-in-law's construction company, which means you now own 60% of your son-in-law's construction company. The words hung in the air like smoke from a suddenly extinguished fire. Maeve felt her breath catch in her throat. "That's not possible," she whispered. "Dave is always talking about his business, his investments, his success. Funded largely by your husband's money," Victoria said gently. Money that was technically an investment with very specific terms. Terms that Dave agreed to when he was desperate for capital, and probably didn't read as carefully as he should have. Maeve thought about all the family dinners where Dave had held court, talking about his latest projects, his expansion plans, his vision for the future, all while looking at her with barely concealed impatience when she asked questions or tried to contribute to the conversation. "And the apartment building?" she asked. "Also yours." Harold purchased it through a partnership agreement that's about to mature. As of next month, you'll own the entire property outright. The room seemed to tilt slightly around Maeve. All these years, she thought of herself as Harold's widow, dependent on his pension and Social Security, careful with every dollar because she believed that was all there was. But Harold had been building something else entirely, an empire of quiet protection that would activate the moment she needed it most. "Why didn't he tell me?" she asked. Victoria's expression softened. "He said you had enough to worry about with his illness. He wanted you to be able to focus on taking care of him, without the burden of business decisions. But he also said—" She paused, consulting her notes. "He said that when the time came, you'd know exactly what to do with the tools he was leaving you." That afternoon, Maeve drove home with copies of every document tucked safely in her purse and Victoria's business card in her wallet. The familiar streets of her neighborhood looked different somehow, as if she were seeing them through new eyes. Every house, every tree, every sidewalk crack seemed to hold possibilities she'd never considered before. She pulled into her driveway and sat for a moment, looking at the home she'd shared with Harold for 4 decades. The porch swing where they'd watch storms roll in. The garden where she still grew tomatoes every summer. The windows that framed their life together, season after season, year after year. Dave's truck was parked across the street, and through her living room window, she could see him pacing back and forth while Dawn sat on the couch, her shoulders hunched in a way that reminded Maeve of the little girl who used to hide behind her mother's skirt when strangers came to the door. Maeve took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and walked toward her front door with the measured pace of a woman who had just remembered what it felt like to hold all the cards. Inside, the conversation stopped the moment she entered. Dave turned to face her with his practiced smile, but there was something different in his eyes now, a wariness that hadn't been there before. "Maeve, good, you're back," he said. "Dawn and I were just discussing the timeline for getting you moved into Sunshine Manor. We think it would be best if we expedite the process." "Expedite," Maeve repeated, setting her purse down on the table Harold had built from reclaimed barnwood. "That's an interesting word choice." Dawn looked up from the couch, and Maeve was struck by how young her daughter looked in that moment, how lost. When had Dawn started looking to her husband for all the answers? When had she stopped trusting her own judgment, her own mother? "Mom, we just want what's best for you," Dawn said, but her voice lacked conviction. "And what's best for me is giving up my home, my independence, and my dignity so that you too can—" "What exactly?" Maeve asked, her voice calm but carrying an edge that made Dave's smile falter slightly. "So that you can be safe," Dave said, his tone shifting into the patronizing register he used when he thought he was dealing with someone too simple to understand complex concepts. "So that you can be around people who can take care of you properly." Maeve walked to the windowsill and touched one of the violet's leaves gently. The plant had been struggling, starved of the light it needed to thrive. But roots ran deep, and sometimes what looked like weakness was just preparation for an unexpected bloom. "Tell me, Dave," she said, not turning around, "how's business these days?" The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut glass. When Maeve finally turned around, Dave's face had gone pale beneath his perpetual tan. Business is fine," he stammered. "Why do you ask?" "Oh, just curious about my investments," Maeve said casually. "I've been learning so much about my financial situation lately. It's amazing what you can discover when you start asking the right questions." Dawn looked back and forth between her mother and her husband, confusion creeping across her features. "What investments? Mom, what are you talking about?" Maeve smiled, really smiled, for the first time in months. It was Harold's smile, the one he used to wear when he'd figure out how to fix something that everyone else had given up on. "I think," she said, settling into Harold's favorite chair with the satisfaction of a queen claiming her throne, "it's time we had a real conversation about who owns what in this family." The afternoon light slanted through the window, illuminating the violet on the sill. And for the first time since Harold's death, Maeve thought she saw the beginning of a new bloom pushing up to the green leaves, reaching toward the light with stubborn, beautiful determination. The silence stretched between them like a wire pulled taut, vibrating with tension that threatened to snap at any moment. Dave's face had gone through several shades of pale, finally settling on something that reminded Maeve of old milk left too long in the sun. "I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing," Dave said, his voice losing all pretense of kindness. "But this conversation is over. We have legal guardianship papers ready to file if you want to be difficult about this." The threat hung in the air like smoke, acrid and choking. Dawn's head snapped up to stare at her husband, something flickering in her eyes that Maeve hadn't seen in years. The spark of a strong-willed child who used to stand up to playground bullies twice her size. "Legal guardianship?" Dawn's voice was barely a whisper. "Dave, you never said anything about—" "I didn't want to worry you with the details." Dave cut her off, his attention still focused on Maeve with the intensity of a predator who just realized his prey might have teeth after all. "Your mother is clearly becoming unstable. The incident with the stove, the paranoid accusations." "What incident with the stove?" Maeve asked quietly. Dave's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. In that moment of hesitation, Maeve saw something she'd never noticed before, the careful calculation behind his every word, the way he crafted his lies with just enough detail to sound convincing, but not enough to be easily verified. "You told me," Dawn said slowly, her voice gaining strength, "that Mrs. Patterson called me about Mom leaving the stove on. But I never got a call from Mrs. Patterson." The realization hit Dawn like a physical blow. She sank back against the couch cushions, her hand instinctively moving to cover her stomach, a gesture that made Maeve's breath catch in her throat. "Dawn," Maeve said gently. "Sweetheart, are you—" "3 months," Dawn whispered, her eyes never leaving her husband's face. "I'm 3 months pregnant." She looked up at Maeve then, and her eyes were filled with tears. "Dave said we needed to get everything settled before the baby comes. He said you were getting confused, forgetting things, that it wasn't safe for you to live alone." The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with awful clarity. A pregnant daughter, vulnerable and dependent, a mother-in-law with valuable assets, a man who'd built his entire life on other people's money and other people's trust. "Dave," Maeve said, her voice carrying 43 years of marriage to a good man and the quiet authority that came with finally understanding the game she'd been forced to play. "I think it's time you and I discussed our business relationship." "What business relationship?" Dave snarled, his mask finally slipping completely. "You don't know anything about business. You're just a lonely old woman whose husband left you a house you can't afford to maintain." Maeve reached into her purse and pulled out the folder Victoria had prepared for her. Copies of every document Harold had left behind, organized with the methodical precision that had made her husband such a successful engineer. "Harold left me quite a few things," she said, opening the folder on the coffee table, "including a 60% stake in Meridian Construction, your construction company, Dave." The color drained from Dave's face so quickly that Maeve worried he might faint. Dawn leaned forward, staring at the documents her mother was spreading across the table like cards in a winning hand. "That's impossible," Dave breathed. Harold was very thorough, Maeve continued, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Every loan, every investment, every partnership agreement, all documented, all legal, all designed to protect the people he loved. Dawn picked up one of the documents. The partnership agreement for the apartment building where she and Dave lived. Mom, this says you own the building we live in. As of next month, yes. Your father-in-law was a very clever man, sweetheart. He saw what I was too trusting to see. Dave lunged forward, trying to snatch the papers away. But Maeve was ready for him. She'd lived with Harold long enough to know that preparation was everything, and Victoria had prepared her well. These are copies, she said calmly. The originals are in my attorney's safe, along with some very interesting documents about financial irregularities in Meridian Construction's books. Apparently, you've been using company funds for personal expenses. That's embezzlement, Dave. The word hung in the air like a judgment. Dave's hands clenched into fists, and for a moment, Maeve saw something in his eyes that made her grateful for the solid bulk of Harold's favorite chair between them. You can't prove anything, he said, but his voice cracked like a teenager's. Actually, I can. Harold was more involved in your business than you realized. He kept copies of everything, bank statements, receipts, emails. Did you really think he'd invest 60% of the company without keeping careful track of where the money was going? Dawn was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face as she looked through document after document that painted her marriage in colors she'd never wanted to see. Dave, is this true? Have you been lying to me about everything? Dave turned on his wife with a fury that made Maeve's blood run cold. You're going to believe her over me? Your own husband? The father of your child? Don't you dare use that baby as a weapon, Maeve said, standing up with a strength that surprised even her. And don't you dare threaten my daughter in my house. Your house. Dave laughed, but it was an ugly sound. We'll see about that. We'll see what a judge thinks about an old woman who's clearly losing her mind, making up stories about business arrangements that don't exist. Maeve smiled then, and it was Harold's smile, patient, knowing, victorious in the quiet way that came from being prepared for every contingency. Funny you should mention judges, she said. I have a meeting scheduled with one next week. Judge David Morales. Family court. I believe you know him. You've been asking him to declare me incompetent, so you can seize power of attorney over my affairs. Dave's face went gray. How did you? Victoria is very thorough. She made some calls, asked some questions. Apparently, Judge Morales is very interested in meeting with me. Something about wanting to hear my side of the story before he makes any decisions about my mental competency. Dawn looked up at her mother with something that might have been hope flickering in her eyes. Mom, I'm so sorry. I thought, Dave said you were confused, that you needed help. I do need help, Maeve said gently. I need help for my daughter. I need her to remember that the woman who raised her, who taught her right from wrong, who loved her unconditionally for 32 years, doesn't suddenly become the enemy just because she gets older. Dave was backing toward the door now, his eyes darting between Maeve and Dawn like a cornered animal looking for escape. This isn't over, he said. I have rights. I have claims. You have debts, Maeve corrected. Substantial debts to the majority shareholders of your company. Debts that are coming due very soon, unless you can demonstrate that you're capable of running an honest business. As Dave fled the house, slamming the door behind him hard enough to rattle the windows, Dawn collapsed into tears that seemed to come from somewhere so deep that Maeve worried they might never stop. But sometimes tears were the price of awakening, and sometimes the only way out of nightmare was to cry yourself back to consciousness. Maeve moved to sit beside her daughter on the couch, the same couch where she'd once comforted a little girl afraid of thunderstorms. Some things, she realized, never really changed. Love was still love, even when it had to wear armor to survive. The courthouse steps were worn smooth by decades of people seeking justice, and Maeve climbed with the measured pace of someone who had learned that dignity was not about speed, but about purpose. Dawn walked beside her, one hand resting protectively over the small curve of her belly, the other clutching a folder of documents they'd spent the past week organizing together. The past 7 days had been a revelation. Once Dave had fled the house that first evening, Dawn had begun to remember things. Small moments that had been pushed aside or explained away, instances where her husband's version of reality hadn't quite matched what she'd experienced herself. The pregnancy had made her vulnerable, but it had also made her fierce in ways she'd forgotten she could be. "Are you sure about this, Mom?" Dawn asked as they paused at the courthouse entrance. "Once we go in there, there's no going back." Maeve looked at her daughter, really looked at her, and saw not the uncertain woman who'd sat in her kitchen a week ago, but the strong-willed child who'd once stood up to the teacher who was treating another student unfairly. That child had never really disappeared. She'd just been buried under years of gaslighting and manipulation. "Sweetheart," Maeve said, adjusting the collar of the navy blue dress she'd worn at Harold's funeral, the one that made her feel like she could face anything. "There's something you need to understand. We're not going back to anything. We're going forward to something better." Inside, the courtroom smelled of old wood and fresh coffee, justice and bureaucracy mixing in the air like incense. Victoria Reeves sat at the plaintiff's table, her silver hair swept back in a style that spoke of competence and confidence. She looked up as Maeve and Dawn entered, and her smile carried the satisfaction of a chess player who'd been thinking 3 moves ahead since the game began. Day was already seated at the defendant's table with his attorney, a nervous-looking man who kept shuffling papers as if he could somehow reorganize reality to better suit his client's needs. Day himself looked like he hadn't slept in days, his usual tan replaced by a grayish pallor that spoke of stress and sleepless nights. But it was the man in the judge's robes who made Maeve's breath catch in her throat. Judge David Morales was older now, his dark hair silver at the temples, his face marked by the weight of countless difficult decisions. But she would have recognized those eyes anywhere, the same eyes that had looked at her with such gratitude 30 years ago when she'd helped him through the most difficult period of his young life. He looked up as she entered the courtroom, and for a moment, time collapsed like a folding fan. She saw the 25-year-old law student who'd worked nights at the diner, where she'd been a waitress, the young man who'd been struggling to pay for school while sending money home to his sick mother. She'd slipped him extra food when the manager wasn't looking, had listened to his worries during slow late-night shifts, had been the one who convinced the diner owner to let him switch to day shifts so he could attend his evening classes. "Mrs. Morrison," Judge Morales said, and his voice carried years of education and experience. But underneath it, she could still hear echoes of the grateful young man who'd once told her she was the kindest person he'd ever met. "Your Honor," she replied, her voice steady. Dave's attorney stood up, shuffling his papers with increasing desperation. "Your Honor, my client contests these proceedings. Mrs. Morrison is clearly not competent to—" "Sit down, counsel," Judge Morales said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd spent decades separating truth from manipulation. "I'll determine who is and isn't competent in my courtroom." The hearing that followed was unlike anything Maeve had expected. Victoria had prepared her for legal arguments and document reviews. But what unfolded was something deeper, a careful excavation of the truth that had been buried under months of lies and manipulation. Dave's attorney tried to paint Maeve as confused and forgetful, but every accusation crumbled under the weight of evidence Harold had meticulously collected. When they claimed she left the stove on, phone records showed that Mrs. Patterson had never called Dawn. When they suggested she was financially incompetent, bank statements revealed that her accounts were perfectly managed and her bills were paid months in advance. But it was when Dave himself took the stand that the facade finally cracked completely. "Mr. Carlson," Victoria said, her voice carrying the kind of polite menace that had been striking fear into hostile witnesses for decades, "you've testified that you are concerned about your mother-in-law's mental state. Can you tell the court about your business relationship with Mrs. Morrison?" Dave's face went pale. "I don't have a business relationship with her." Victoria approached the witness stand with a document in her hand. "This is a partnership agreement dated 3 years ago. It shows that Harold Morrison invested $300,000 in Meridian Construction, your company, in exchange for a 60% stake in the business. Are you saying you weren't aware of this agreement?" That's not how it worked," Dave stammered. "Harold was just helping us out. It was a loan, not an investment." "A loan," Victoria repeated. "Do you have documentation of this loan? Repayment schedules? Interest agreements?" The silence that followed was deafening. Dave's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. What you do have, Victoria continued, is a pattern of financial irregularities. Company funds used for personal vacations, luxury purchases charged to business accounts, and a systematic attempt to isolate and control the majority shareholder of your company, Mrs. Morrison. Dave's attorney objected, but Judge Morales overruled him with a look that could have frozen water in July. "Continue, counselor," he said to Victoria. "Mr. Carlson, isn't it true that you've been using your wife's pregnancy to manipulate both her and her mother? That you've been pressuring Mrs. Morrison to sign over power of attorney so you could gain control of assets worth over $2 million. The number hung in the air like a thunderclap. Dawn's gasp was audible from the gallery, and Maeve felt her own heart skip a beat. $2 million. Harold had been even more protective than she'd realized. Dave's composure cracked like ice under pressure. She's just an old woman. She doesn't understand business, doesn't understand what's at stake. Someone has to look out for her. Someone like you? Victoria asked, her voice dripping with skepticism. Yes, Dawn and I are her family. We're the ones who care about her. Is that why you lied to your wife about Mrs. Patterson calling? Is that why you've been telling your pregnant wife that her mother is becoming senile when there's no medical evidence to support that claim? Is that why you've been pressuring an elderly woman to give up her home and her independence? Dave was sweating now, his carefully constructed persona dissolving under the relentless pressure of truth. You don't understand the situation. Maeve can't handle all this responsibility. She needs someone to take care of things for her. Judge Morales leaned forward, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of every injustice he'd seen in 30 years on the bench. Mr. Carlson, in my experience, when someone says an elderly person can't handle their own affairs, what they usually mean is that they want to handle those affairs themselves. The judge's eyes found Maeve's across the courtroom, and in them she saw not just a recognition of their shared history, but something deeper. The understanding that came from watching too many families destroy themselves over money and pride. Mrs. Morrison, Judge Morales said, would you please approach the bench? Maeve stood on unsteady legs, her heart pounding against her ribs like a bird trying to escape a cage. She walked in front of the courtroom, past Dave's incredulous stare, past the whispered conversations in the gallery, past 30 years of accumulated doubt and deference. Mrs. Morrison, the judge said quietly, do you remember me? I remember a young man who worked harder than anyone should have to, Your Honor, a young man who never gave up, even when everything seemed impossible. Judge Morales smiled then, a real smile that transformed his stern judicial features into something warmer, more human. That young man never forgot the woman who believed in him when he couldn't believe it himself. The woman who made sure he had enough to eat, who listened when he was scared he'd never make it through law school, who told him that kindness was never wasted, even when it seemed like the world was too cruel for kindness to matter. Tears pricked at the corners of Maeve's eyes. She'd forgotten about those late-night conversations in the empty diner, about the extra sandwiches she'd wrapped up for him to take home, about the night she'd found him crying over his law books because he was afraid he wasn't smart enough to become the lawyer his family needed him to be. Your Honor, she whispered, you were always smart enough. You just needed someone to remind you. And now, he said, his voice carrying across the courtroom, I get to remind you of something. Mrs. Morrison, you are not incompetent. You are not confused. You are not a burden or a problem to be solved. You are a woman who has every right to live her life with dignity and autonomy, in her own home, making her own decisions, surrounded by people who love and respect her. He turned his attention back to the courtroom, his voice becoming official again, carrying the weight of legal judgment. I find no evidence whatsoever of mental incompetence on the part of Mrs. Morrison. Her financial affairs are in perfect order. Her living situation is safe and appropriate, and her decision-making capacity is entirely intact. Furthermore, I find that Mr. Carlson has engaged in a pattern of financial and emotional manipulation designed to gain control of assets that do not belong to him. Dave's attorney was on his feet again, objecting to something, but his words were lost in the roar of blood in Maeve's ears. She felt Dawn's hand slip into hers, felt her daughter's fingers squeeze tight, with strength that reminded her of the little girl who used to hold her hand during thunderstorms. The petition for guardianship is denied. Judge Morales continued. Furthermore, I am ordering a full audit of Meridian Construction's finances, and I am granting Mrs. Morrison's request for a restraining order preventing Mr. Carlson from having any contact with her or her property. The gavel came down with sound like a door slamming shut on one life and opening onto another. In the gallery, Maeve heard someone crying, soft tears of relief that might have been her own or Dawn's or both. But what she remembered most clearly later was the moment when Judge Morales stepped down from the bench as the courtroom was clearing, when he approached her with the careful respect he might show to a visiting dignitary. Mrs. Morrison, he said, 30 years ago, you told me that the world needed more kindness, not less. You said that every time we choose compassion over cruelty, we make the world a little bit better. I remember, Maeve said. Today, he said, justice chose compassion. Your husband's protections worked exactly as he intended them to. But more than that, your daughter chose love over fear, truth over convenience. That's your real legacy, Mrs. Morrison. Not the money or the property, but the kind of person you raise, the kind of person who can find her way back to what's right even when she's lost in the dark for a while. As they walked down the courthouse steps together, Dawn's hand still clasped in hers, Maeve felt something she hadn't experienced in months. It wasn't victory, exactly, though they had certainly won. It wasn't relief, though the crushing weight of fear had lifted from her shoulders. It was something simpler and more profound. It was a feeling of being exactly where she belonged, exactly when she needed to be there, with exactly the right person beside her. The afternoon sun slanted across the courthouse steps, and somewhere in the distance, Maeve could hear the sound of construction, people building something new where something old had been torn down. It seemed somehow like the perfect soundtrack for the beginning of whatever came next. 3 months later, Maeve stood in the garden behind her house, watching Dawn plant tomatoes in the same patch of earth where Harold had grown his prized beefsteak varieties for 20 years. Her daughter moved carefully, mindfully, one hand resting on the pronounced curve of her belly, while the other pressed seedlings into the rich soil with the patience of someone who had learned to tend growing things with proper care. A little more to the left, Maeve suggested, settling into the wooden chair Harold had built for garden supervision. That spot gets the morning sun. Dawn adjusted the placement and looked up with dirt under her fingernails and satisfaction in her eyes. Like this. Perfect. The word hung between them, comfortable and true. Nothing was actually perfect, of course. Dawn was 6 months pregnant and newly divorced, living in her childhood bedroom, while she figured out what came next. Dave had moved out of state after the audit revealed the full extent of his financial manipulations, and the restraining order ensured he had no legal right to contact any of them. The construction company was being restructured under new management. The apartment building had been sold to fund Dawn's fresh start, and there were still nights when Dawn woke up crying from dreams where she was trapped in conversations that never quite made sense. But there was something healing about the rhythm of planting season, about the faith required to put seeds in the ground and trust that something beautiful would grow from them. "Mom," Dawn said, sitting back on her heels, "I need to tell you something." Maeve felt a familiar flutter of anxiety in her chest. The legacy of months when every serious conversation had been a prelude to loss. But Dawn's expression was thoughtful rather than troubled, and her voice carried the steady calm she'd been developing over the past few weeks. "What is it, sweetheart?" "I want to name the baby Serenity. Serenity Hope Morrison Clark." Maeve felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. Dawn had taken back her maiden name after the divorce, a small act of reclamation that had felt monumentally important to them both. "Serenity," Maeve repeated, testing the name on her tongue. "I love it. I keep thinking about what Judge Morales said about choosing compassion over cruelty, about making the world a little bit better." Dawn pressed her palm against her belly. "I want her to grow up knowing that peace is possible, even after everything falls apart." They worked together in comfortable silence for a while, Dawn planting while Maeve offered guidance born of decades of coaxing life from stubborn earth. The African violet from the kitchen windowsill now sat in a place of honor on the porch, its purple blooms a testament to the miraculous resilience of living things when given proper care and sufficient light. "There's something else," Dawn said eventually, settling beside Maeve on the garden bench Harold had crafted from reclaimed wood. Victoria called this morning. Maeve looked at her daughter, noting the particular quality of excitement that Dawn had been trying to contain all afternoon. What did she say? The Home and Dignity Foundation is officially approved. The first grants can go out next month. The foundation had been Maeve's idea, born from sleepless nights spent thinking about other elderly people who might be facing what she had faced, other families being torn apart by greed disguised as concern. Half of Harold's legacy would fund an organization dedicated to providing legal assistance and advocacy for older adults experiencing financial abuse or family manipulation. How many applications came in? Maeve asked. 47 in the first week alone. Dawn's voice was quiet, heavy with the weight of understanding how common their story actually was. Victoria says the need is even greater than we anticipated. Maeve nodded, feeling a familiar mixture of sadness and determination. Harold had protected her, but he couldn't protect everyone. The foundation was her way of extending that protection to others, of turning her pain into purpose the way Harold would have wanted. And the speaking engagements? 12 requests so far. Senior centers, legal aid societies, community groups. They want to hear your story, Mom. They want to learn from what you went through. The idea of public speaking still terrified Maeve, but Victoria had convinced her that there was power in bearing witness, in standing up and saying, "This happened to me, and it doesn't have to happen to you." Every person who heard her story and learned to recognize the warning signs was potentially one less family torn apart by manipulation and greed. I've been thinking about what to call the program. Dawn said, "How about seeing the signs? Simple, direct, memorable." "I like it," Maeve said, "though I think we need to add something about fighting back. It's not enough just to recognize what's happening. People need to know they have options." Dawn smiled, the expression transforming her face in ways that reminded Maeve of the determined child she'd raised. "How about seeing the signs, finding your voice?" Perfect. They sat together as the afternoon light began to slant toward evening, watching their newly planted garden and thinking about all the growing that lay ahead. Somewhere in the house behind them, the phone rang. Probably another foundation call, or a reporter wanted to interview the woman who'd taken on financial elder abuse and won, or one of the dozen lawyers who'd been calling since the story broke in the local news. But for now, they stayed in the garden, surrounded by the promise of tomatoes and herbs and flowers that would bloom in their own time, at their own pace, tended by hands that understood the difference between nurturing and controlling. "Dawn," Maeve said as the sun began to set behind the new construction that had once seemed like such an invasion of their privacy, "do you think your father would be proud of what we've done?" Dawn was quiet for so long that Maeve wondered if she'd fallen asleep, lulled by the warmth of the afternoon and the exhaustion that came with growing a baby and rebuilding a life simultaneously. But finally, her daughter spoke. "I think he'd be amazed," Dawn said, "not because he didn't believe you were strong enough to do this, but because he spent so much energy trying to protect you from ever having to prove how strong you really are." The words settled over them like a blessing, like Harold's presence made manifest in the wisdom of the daughter they'd raised together. As darkness fell over the garden and the first stars appeared in the clearing sky, May thought about the seeds they planted that day, tomatoes and herbs, and the more intangible seeds of justice and hope and healing that were already beginning to sprout in ways they couldn't yet imagine. Tomorrow, she would call back the reporters and the lawyers and the people who wanted to hear her story. She would continue the work of turning her experience into advocacy, her survival into service. But tonight, she would sit in her garden with her daughter, listening to the sound of new life growing all around them, and remember that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply refusing to be diminished. The African violet on the porch seemed to glow purple in the moonlight, its blooms open and unashamed, reaching toward whatever light they could find. The Riverside Community Center smelled like coffee and old upholstery, and the folding chairs were arranged in neat rows that reminded Maeve of the chapel. She stood at the podium, looking out at 43 faces, mostly women, mostly over 60, all bearing the careful expressions of people who had learned not to trust easily. "My name is Mae Morrison," she began, her voice stronger than she'd expected it to be. "And until 6 months ago, I thought I was losing my mind." A ripple of recognition moved through the audience like wind through wheat. These were her people, Women who had been told they were confused when they were actually being confused, who had been called paranoid when they were being methodically isolated from their own lives. My daughter and son-in-law wanted me to sign over power of attorney so they could take care of me. Maeve continued, settling into the rhythm of a story she'd told dozens of times now, each telling making it feel less like a wound and more like a tool. They said I was forgetting things, making mistakes, becoming a danger to myself. In the front row, an elderly man nodded grimly. Beside him, a woman who couldn't have been more than 65 clutched the tissue with white knuckles. These were the faces of financial elder abuse. Not the dramatic scenarios from television movies, but the quiet, systematic erosion of autonomy disguised as concern. The thing about gaslighting, Maeve said, using the term Victoria had taught her, is that it works. After months of being told you're confused, you start to wonder if maybe you really are. After months of being told you can't handle your own affairs, you start to believe that maybe you can't. She told him about the lies Dave had told, about the way he'd used Dawn's pregnancy as leverage, about the slow, careful way he'd tried to separate her from her own life. But she also told him about Harold's preparations, about Victoria's expertise, about the moment she'd realized that being kind didn't mean being defenseless. The most important thing I learned, she said, reaching the heart of her presentation, is that trust has to be earned, even from family, especially from family. After the formal presentation came the part that Maeve had grown to love, the questions and stories and shared experiences that transformed a speech into a conversation. An 80-year-old woman named Ruth talked about her grandson who'd been pressuring her to sell her house. A man in his 70s described a daughter-in-law who'd been slowly taking over his bank accounts. A widow named Janet whispered about feeling guilty for suspecting her own children of manipulating her finances. Guilt is their weapon, Maeve told Janet gently. They make you feel selfish for wanting to protect yourself, ungrateful for questioning their motives. But protecting yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary. After the crowd dispersed, Maeve found herself sitting in the empty community center with Victoria and Dawn, all three women drained by the emotional weight of hearing so many similar stories. 43 people, Dawn said, her hand resting on her now prominent belly. 43 families dealing with some version of what we went through. That's just in one community, Victoria added grimly. The National Council on Aging estimates that 1 in 10 older adults experiences some form of financial abuse, and that's probably underreported. Maeve looked around the empty room, thinking about all the stories she'd heard that afternoon. Ruth, whose grandson had convinced her that her house was too much responsibility. Frank, whose son had been forging his signature on checks. Janet, whose daughter had moved in to help and had gradually taken over every aspect of her mother's financial life. We need to do more, Maeve said quietly. Mom, you're already doing more than anyone could expect, Dawn protested. The foundation, the speaking engagements, the legal advocacy. It's not enough. Maeve stood and walked to the window that looked out over the community center's parking lot, where people were still sitting in their cars, probably processing what they'd heard, probably trying to decide whether they had the courage to make the phone calls they needed to make. We're helping people react to abuse after it starts. We need to help them prevent it before it happens. Victoria leaned forward with the interest of someone who'd spent 30 years fighting battles one case at a time. What are you thinking? Education, Maeve said, turning back to face them, not just for the potential victims, but for their families, for their children and grandchildren. Most people don't wake up one day and decide to defraud their elderly parents. It happens gradually, sometimes without them even realizing what they're doing. She thought about Dawn, about how easy it had been for Dave to manipulate her genuine concern into something that looked like care but functioned like control, about how many adult children might be making decisions for their parents not out of greed, but out of a misguided belief that they knew what was best. We need a program that helps families have honest conversations about aging, about independence, about the difference between helping and taking over. Maeve continued, something that helps people recognize the warning signs in their own behavior, not just in others. Dawn looked up from her chair, her eyes bright with the kind of engagement Maeve hadn't seen in her daughter for years, like a workshop series, loving without taking over, or something like that. Exactly. Mae felt the familiar spark of excitement that came with a good idea finding its shape. We could partner with senior centers, community colleges, religious organizations. Make it as accessible as possible. Victoria was already pulling out her phone, probably to make notes or start researching funding opportunities. This could be revolutionary, Maeve. Most prevention programs focus on the potential victims. But if we can reach the adult children, the caregivers, the people who might become perpetrators without meaning to, we might actually be able to stop some of this before it starts. Maeve finished. As they walked to their cars in the gathering dusk, Maeve felt the weight of possibility settling over her like a mantle. 6 months ago, she'd been a frightened widow being pressured to give up everything that mattered to her. Tonight, she was a woman with a mission, with resources, with the kind of purpose that made every challenge feel like an opportunity. The drive home took her through neighborhoods where porch lights were beginning to flicker on, where families were gathering around dinner tables and television sets, where the complex dynamics of love and money and power were playing out in countless variations. How many of those families would benefit from honest conversations about aging and independence? How many crises could be prevented with the right education at the right time? At home, she found the African violet on the porch blooming more abundantly than ever, its purple flowers bright against the green leaves. The plant had nearly died once, starved of light and proper care. But with attention and patience in the right conditions, it had not just survived but flourished. Maeve touched one of the soft petals gently and thought about seeds and growth and the mysterious alchemy that transformed pain into purpose. Tomorrow, she would start making the phone calls that would turn tonight's idea into reality. But for now, she would sit on the porch swing Harold had built with his own hands, listening to the sound of her daughter moving around in the kitchen, preparing for the grandchild who would grow up knowing that love and respect could coexist, that protection didn't require control, that some battles were worth fighting not just for victory, but for the principle of the thing. The night air carried the scent of blooming flowers and growing things, of possibilities planted and tended with care. And for the first time since Harold's death, Maeve felt not just surviving but truly alive, rooted in purpose and reaching toward whatever light she could find. Dawn's labor began at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday in October. With the kind of gentle insistence that suggested baby Serenity had inherited her grandmother's sense of timing. By the time they reached the hospital, the contractions were coming strong and steady, and Dawn's grip on Maeve's hand had progressed from reassuring squeeze to bone-crushing determination. This is harder than divorcing Dave. Dawn panted between contractions, and despite everything, they both started laughing. Well, this is a much better ending, Maeve replied, brushing sweat-dampened hair away from her daughter's forehead. Serenity Hope Morrison Clark entered the world at 6:47 a.m., screaming with the righteous indignation of someone who had just been evicted from the most comfortable housing she'd ever known. But when the nurse placed her in Dawn's arms, she settled immediately, as if she'd just been waiting to be properly introduced to the people who would love her most. "Look at her," Dawn whispered, her voice filled with the kind of wonder that made everything else in the world seem temporary and small. "She's perfect." Maeve leaned over to study her granddaughter's face. The tiny features that already seemed to hold hints of Harold's stubborn chin and Dawn's expressive eyes. Serenity's fingers were impossibly small, but they gripped Maeve's thumb with surprising strength, as if she already understood that holding on was important. "She has your father's hands," Maeve murmured. "Long fingers. He would have loved teaching her to build things." They spent the morning in a quiet bubble of new motherhood, taking turns holding Serenity, while she slept and ate and generally demonstrated that she was exactly as perfect as the universe had intended her to be. It wasn't until the afternoon that reality began to intrude in the form of phone calls and visitors and the practical concerns of people who had lives to live beyond the four walls of a hospital room. Victoria arrived first, bearing flowers and the kind of legal documents that followed Maeve everywhere now. "The Morrison Family Foundation wants to set up a college fund for her," she announced, settling into the visitor's chair with the satisfaction of someone delivering good news. "Seems only appropriate that the youngest Morrison should benefit from the legacy that's helping so many others." Judge David Morales came by during visiting hours, still in his judicial robes, carrying a stuffed animal that looked like it had been purchased with great care and considerable uncertainty about what babies actually wanted. "Mrs. Morrison," he said formally, but his smile was warm. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion. I want to congratulate you and meet the newest member of the family that's been changing our community for the better." He held Serenity with the careful reverence of someone who understood that small things could have enormous impact, who had learned that justice often came in quiet moments rather than dramatic proclamations. "Your grandmother," he told the sleeping baby, "is going to teach you about fighting for what's right. But more than that, she's going to teach you about the difference between fighting against something and fighting for something." As the afternoon faded into evening and the visitors went home to their own lives, Maeve found herself alone with Dawn and Serenity in the golden light that filtered through the hospital room windows. Dawn was dozing, exhausted by the work of bringing life into the world, and Serenity was sleeping in the clear plastic bassinet that seemed too small to contain all the possibilities she represented. Maeve pulled her chair close to the bassinet and studied her granddaughter's face, thinking about all the things she wanted to tell her, all the lessons she hoped to pass on before her own time ran out. "Your mother was about your size when we brought her home," she whispered to the sleeping baby. "I was so scared I wouldn't know how to take care of her properly. Your grandfather had to remind me that babies don't come with instruction manuals, but they do come with an amazing ability to teach their parents what they need." Serenity's tiny chest rose and fell with the steady rhythm of someone who had never doubted that the world would take care of her basic needs. There was something profoundly trusting about the way babies slept, something that reminded Maeve of the faith required to plant seeds in the fall and trust that spring would come. "I want to tell you about your great-grandfather," Maeve continued, her voice barely audible in the quiet room. "He was the kind of man who prepared for problems before they happened, who protected the people he loved in ways they didn't even understand until much later. He built things that lasted, birdhouses and garden benches, and legal documents that kept his family safe long after he was gone." She reached into the bassinet and let Serenity's tiny fingers wrap around her thumb again, marveling at the strength in that small grip. "He would have spoiled you absolutely rotten," she admitted. "Would have built you a dollhouse that was nicer than most people's actual houses. Would have taught you to use tools and plant tomatoes and stand up for yourself when people try to make you feel small." Dawn stirred in her sleep, murmuring something that might have been Harold's name, and Maeve felt a familiar ache of missing him mixed with profound gratitude for everything he'd left behind. "But your mother and I will teach you those things," she promised Serenity. "We'll teach you that being kind doesn't mean being weak, that trusting people doesn't mean trusting everyone, that love sometimes has to wear armor to survive." Outside the hospital window, the sun was setting over a city where 43 people from that first community center meeting were living slightly different lives because they'd learned to recognize the signs of financial abuse, where the Home and Dignity Foundation was processing grant applications from elderly people who needed legal help to protect themselves from families who'd forgotten the difference between caring and controlling, where Victoria Reeves was working late in her office, building cases that would set precedents for elder rights across the state. "You're being born into a world that's a little bit better than it was when I was your age," Maeve told her granddaughter. "Not perfect, not even close to perfect, but better. And maybe if we do our job right, it'll be a little bit better still by the time you're old enough to make changes of your own." Dawn's eyes opened, still heavy with exhaustion, but bright with contentment. "What are you two talking about over there?" "Just telling her about her legacy," Maeve said, "about all the people who loved her before she was even born." Dawn smiled and held out her arms, and Maeve carefully transferred the baby to her mother's embrace, watching as Serenity settled immediately against Dawn's chest, as if that was exactly where she'd always belonged. "Mom," Dawn said quietly, "I want her to know the story. All of it. I want her to understand what you went through, what we learned, how we turned something terrible into something that helps other people." "She'll know," Maeve promised. "But more than that, she'll see. She'll grow up watching you stand up for yourself, watching me fight for people who can't fight for themselves. She'll learn by example what it looks like to transform pain into purpose." As night fell over the hospital and the sound of the city softened into the background hum of a world settling into sleep, 3 generations of Morrison women held on to each other in a way that mattered most. Not with desperation or fear, but with a quiet confidence that comes from knowing you're exactly where you belong, exactly when you need to be there, The African violet from Maeve's windowsill had sent out runners over the summer, creating new plants that now bloomed in windows throughout the neighborhood. It was a kind of legacy Harold would have appreciated. Something beautiful and resilient, spreading light wherever it was planted, reaching toward whatever growth was possible. 2 years later, Maeve stood at the podium of the state capitol auditorium, looking out at an audience that included legislators, legal advocates, social workers, and family members whose stories had become part of the tapestry of change she'd helped weave across the state. At 71, she had discovered that her voice carried better in large spaces than she'd ever imagined, that the words came easier when she was speaking for people who couldn't speak for themselves. The Morrison Family Foundation has helped over 300 families in the past 2 years, she began, her voice steady and strong. But more importantly, our prevention programs have reached over 5,000 adult children, helping them understand the difference between caring for their aging parents and taking control of their lives. In the front row, Dawn sat with 2-year-old Serenity on her lap, the little girl's dark curls catching the light as she played quietly with a small wooden toy Harold would have been proud to have made. Serenity had inherited her great-grandfather's mechanical aptitude and her grandmother's stubborn streak, a combination that suggested she would grow up to be formidable in all the best ways. Today, I want to talk about something that doesn't make the headlines, Maeve continued. Something that happens in living rooms and kitchen tables, and lawyers' offices across our state every day. I want to talk about the quiet violence of being told you don't know your own mind. The phrase had become one of her signature expressions, something that resonated with audiences because it captured the particular cruelty of financial elder abuse. Not the dramatic theft that made evening news, but the slow erosion of autonomy that happened behind closed doors in families that looked perfectly normal from the outside. She told them about Mrs. Chun, whose son had convinced her to sign over power of attorney, and then sold her house without her knowledge. About Robert Martinez, whose daughter had been slowly draining his accounts to fund her own lifestyle. About Sarah Williams, whose family had been preparing to have her declared incompetent so they could access her late husband's pension. All of them had been helped by the foundation. All of them had learned to fight back. But more importantly, dozens of other families had attended the foundation's workshops and learned to have the difficult conversations before crisis struck. The most radical thing we can do, Maeve said, reaching a conclusion she'd been building toward, is to believe elderly people when they tell us they're being mistreated, to understand that aging doesn't automatically equal incompetence, that needing help with some things doesn't mean needing help with everything, that the desire to remain independent isn't stubbornness, it's human dignity asserting itself. The standing ovation that followed felt different from the polite applause she received at her first speaking engagements. This was recognition, validation, the sound of people who had been changed by what they'd heard and were ready to carry that change forward into their own communities. Afterward, at the reception hosted by the State Office on Aging, Mae found herself surrounded by people whose faces had become familiar over the past 2 years. Victoria, who had left private practice to work full-time for the foundation, Judge Morales, who had become an unofficial advocate for elder rights throughout the judicial system, Ruth, the woman from that first community center meeting, who had successfully fought off her grandson's attempts to force her from her home. But it was the new faces that excited Maeve most. Young lawyers who wanted to specialize in elder law, social workers who were incorporating financial abuse recognition into their training programs, adult children who had attended workshops and learned to support their aging parents without overwhelming them. Mrs. Morrison, a young woman, approached her with the nervous energy of someone meeting a hero. "I'm Jennifer Walsh. I attended one of your workshops last year with my mother and my sisters. We were making some of the same mistakes you talked about, trying to take over Mom's finances because we were scared she couldn't handle them anymore." Maeve smiled, recognizing the expression of someone who had learned to see their own behavior more clearly. "How is your mother now?" "She's great. We set up a system where she manages everything herself, but we have access to help if she asks for it. She's more independent now than she's been in years, and our relationship is so much better because we're not constantly arguing about what she should and shouldn't do." These were the victories that mattered most to Maeve, not the dramatic courtroom confrontations that made good stories, but the quiet triumphs of families learning to love each other without trying to control each other. As the reception wound down, Dawn approached with sleepy serenity in her arms. "Ready to go home, Grandma?" The title still made Maeve's heart skip a little. At 71, she had discovered that becoming a grandmother was like falling in love all over again. The same overwhelming tenderness, the same fierce protectiveness, the same willingness to reorganize your entire life around someone else's needs. "More than ready," she said, reaching for her purse and the folder of thank you letters she'd received that week. The letters were her favorite part of the Foundation's work. Handwritten notes from people whose lives had been changed by workshops or legal assistance, or simply by learning that they weren't alone in what they'd experienced. The drive home took them through neighborhoods that had become familiar in a new way over the past 2 years. Here was the community center where she'd given her first presentation. There was the apartment building where Mrs. Chan now lived safely after successfully fighting to keep her assets. Around the corner was a senior center that hosted monthly workshops on financial safety. At home, the house felt both exactly the same and completely transformed. The room still held Harold's presence in the furniture he'd built and the memories they'd shared. But they also held new life. Serenity's toys scattered across the living room, Dawn's law school textbooks stacked on the kitchen table, the constant flow of visitors who came seeking advice or offering help with the Foundation's work. Dawn had enrolled in law school the previous fall, inspired by watching her mother navigate the legal system and determined to become the kind of lawyer who specialized in protecting vulnerable people from those who would exploit them. It was hard work, juggling a toddler and coursework and the part-time job she'd taken at Victoria's firm, but Dawn approached it with the same methodical determination that had helped her rebuild her life after Dave. "You know what I've been thinking about?" Dawn said as they settled Serenity into her crib, the little girl's eyes already heavy with sleep despite her protest that she wasn't tired. "What's that?" Maeve asked, straightening the quilt Harold had somehow known to buy before Serenity was even conceived, as if he'd been preparing for great-grandchildren he'd never meet. "Dad's letters. The ones he left in the filing cabinet. I've been wondering if there are more." Maeve looked at her daughter with surprise. They'd been through Harold's papers thoroughly in the months after the trial, organizing everything for the Foundation and making sure all his legal protections were properly documented. "What makes you think there might be more?" "Just a feeling. You know how he was about preparation. I keep thinking he might have left something for Serenity or for the Foundation or—" Dawn shrugged, suddenly self-conscious. "Maybe I just want there to be more. Maybe I want to feel like he's still helping us figure things out." That night, after Dawn had gone to bed and the house had settled into the comfortable quiet of a place where people felt safe to sleep deeply, Maeve found herself back in Harold's workshop. The space had become a shrine of sorts, not the sad kind that tried to preserve everything exactly as it had been, but the living kind that honored memory while making room for new purposes. She'd moved his tools to make space for Foundation files, had converted his workbench into a desk where she reviewed grant applications and prepared speeches. But she'd kept his filing system intact, partly out of sentiment and partly because Harold's organizational methods were more efficient than anything she could have devised herself. Tonight, she approached the filing cabinet with fresh eyes, looking not just at the labeled folders she'd been through dozens of times, but at the spaces between them, at the way Harold had arranged things with the precision of someone who believed everything had its proper place. That's when she noticed it. A gap at the very back of the bottom drawer, a space that didn't quite make sense given the careful way Harold had organized everything else. She ran her fingers along the back of the drawer and felt the edge of something that shouldn't have been there. It was an envelope, taped to the back wall of the drawer with the kind of care that suggested Harold had wanted it found eventually, but not immediately. Her name was written across the front in his careful script, along with a date that made her heart skip. For Maeve's 75th birthday. For years in the future, Harold had been planning ahead even further than she'd realized. Inside the envelope were 3 things: a letter, a deed to property she'd never heard of, and a small brass key with a tag that simply read "for the future." She sat in Harold's chair and read the letter by the light of the desk lamp he'd built himself from salvage parts, her hands trembling slightly as his familiar handwriting revealed one more layer of protection he'd built around their family. "My dearest Maeve," the letter began, "if you're reading this, It means you survived whatever crisis forced you to go through my papers, and you've had time to catch your breath and start thinking about what comes next. I hope it also means you've discovered that you're stronger than you ever knew, braver than you ever had to be, and more loved than you ever doubted. The property deed was for 20 acres of farmland about an hour outside the city. Land Harold had quietly purchased during his retirement. Land with a small house that needed work in soil that had been fallow for too long, but could be brought back to life with patience and care. I bought this place thinking we might want to escape the city someday, the letter continued. But I realized after I got sick that my ideas about escape were all wrong. The point isn't to get away from the world. It's to create a piece of the world that works the way you think it should work. The brass key, Harold explained, opened a storage shed on the property where he'd been quietly accumulating supplies, tools and seeds and building materials for projects he'd envisioned but never had time to complete. I don't know what the foundation will look like by the time you read this, his letter concluded, but I know it will be something beautiful because everything you touch becomes beautiful eventually. Maybe this place could be part of that. Maybe it could be a retreat where people come to heal, or a training center where they learn to fight back, or just a garden where things grow the way they're supposed to grow, with enough light and water and room to spread their roots. Maeve read the letter 3 times before she trusted herself to walk upstairs, without waking Dawn and Serenity. But she couldn't sleep. She lay in the bed she'd shared with Harold for 37 years, staring at the ceiling and thinking about 20 acres of possibility, about the kind of legacy that kept revealing itself in layers, like gifts that unpacked themselves over time. The next morning, she showed the letter to Dawn over coffee and toast, watching her daughter's face transform as she understood what Harold had been planning. A retreat center, Dawn said softly. Somewhere people could go to recover from financial abuse, to learn their rights, to meet other survivors. Or, Maeve added, thinking of Judge Morales and Victoria and all the professionals who had become part of their extended family. Somewhere we could train lawyers and social workers and judges. Somewhere we could bring families together to have the difficult conversations before they become crises. Dawn looked up from the letter, her eyes bright with the kind of excitement that had been absent from her life for too many years. Mom, this could change everything. Not just for our foundation, but for the whole movement. That afternoon, they drove out to see the property, Serenity secure her car seat and babbling happily about the trees and cows and tractors they passed along the way. The farmhouse was indeed small and in need of work, but it sat on a rise that overlooked rolling fields and a pond that caught the afternoon light like a mirror. The storage shed held treasures that made Maeve laugh and cry simultaneously. Boxes of seed Harold had been saving, tools still wrapped in their original packaging, and plans he'd drawn up for gardens and workshops and gathering spaces that could accommodate everything from intimate family conversations to large conference groups. He thought of everything. Dawn marveled, rifling through sketches for accessible pathways and raised garden beds, and an amphitheater that could seat 50 people under the stars. Serenity toddled to the tall grass, chasing butterflies and picking dandelions with the unself-conscious joy of someone who had never learned to see weeds as anything other than flowers that grew wherever they wanted to grow. Standing in the field Harold had envisioned as a teaching garden, watching her granddaughter explore the world with fearless curiosity while her daughter planned legal strategies that would protect vulnerable families across the state, May felt the presence of something larger than herself, larger than any one person's story of survival and recovery. She felt the presence of transformation itself, the mysterious process by which pain became purpose, grief became gratitude, and love found ways to keep working long after the people who started had moved beyond the reach of ordinary conversation. The African violet on her kitchen windowsill had produced dozens of offspring over the past 2 years, each one a small miracle of persistence and adaptation. But this 20-acre canvas for hope, this was Harold's final violet, his last gift to a world that needed more places where people could learn to bloom in their own time, in their own way, with enough light and space and love to grow into whatever they were meant to become. As the sun set over their new beginning, Maeve pulled out her phone and called Victoria. There were papers to file, plans to make, dreams to turn into reality with the same methodical patience Harold had brought to everything he'd ever built. But first, she stood in a field where healing would grow, holding her granddaughter's hand, while Dawn made notes about workshops and retreat schedules and all the ways they could turn Harold's vision into a living legacy that would outlast them all. The greatest victories, May had learned, weren't the dramatic ones that made headlines. They were the quiet ones that made tomorrow a little bit brighter than today, that gave people permission to hope when hope seemed impossible, that reminded the world that love, real love, never stopped building, never stopped preparing, never stopped reaching toward whatever light it could find. In 4 years, when she turned 75, there would be a celebration in this field. There would be families who would learn to love each other without trying to control each other, elderly people who had discovered they were stronger than they'd ever imagined, and children like Serenity, who would grow up knowing that kindness and strength were not opposites, but partners in the long work of making the world more beautiful. Harold's final letter had ended with words that would become the Foundation's unofficial motto. The best revenge against those who try to diminish you is to grow beyond anything they thought possible. Standing in the field of their shared future, watching Serenity chase fireflies in the gathering dusk, while Dawn planned legal strategies that would change lives across the state, Maeve smiled and whispered to the evening air, "Mission accomplished, my love. Mission accomplished." Maeve's journey teaches us that kindness doesn't mean defenselessness. In our relationships, especially within families, we must learn to distinguish between genuine care and subtle control. When someone repeatedly tells you that you're confused or can't handle your own affairs, trust your instincts. Gaslighting thrives when we doubt ourselves. The most powerful lesson? Preparation is protection. Like Harold's meticulous planning, we should document our assets, understand our legal rights, and have trusted professionals in place before crisis strikes. Don't wait until you're vulnerable to build your support network. For adult children watching aging parents, remember that helping doesn't mean taking over. The desire for independence isn't stubbornness, it's human dignity. Have honest conversations about boundaries. Respect your parents' autonomy, and recognize that needing help with some things doesn't mean needing help with everything. Financial elder abuse affects 1 in 10 older adults, but it's preventable through education and awareness. Trust must be earned, even from family members. Love expressed through control isn't love. It's manipulation disguised as concern. Most importantly, it's never too late to fight back. Like Maeve's African violet reaching toward whatever light it could find, we all have capacity to bloom again, no matter how much darkness we've endured. Thank you for watching the video. Please comment with number 1 to let me know you have watched the whole video. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell to always receive new videos as soon as possible.